we'll try to understand how troubleshooting is done in the BI system. Like in BW system, there are two primary transaction codes for troubleshooting purposes in BI. One is the ST01 and the other one is RSecAdmin. Now ST01 was used in BW also for tracing the problems occurring due to SAP provided authorization objects. But in BW, for troubleshooting the reporting authorization errors, we used to use the transaction RSSM or RSSM trace. That has been replaced in BI with the transaction RSecAdmin. So the transaction code RSecAdmin is specific to BI, and only the characteristics that are specified as authorization relevant and used in the analysis authorizations of the users to control access to info object values are traced. Now, when a user executes a query, so the way the flow happens is that the query starts, then the list of attributes is requested, and now the variable processing and value help. Now hierarchy authorizations are requested. Each request results in a individual block. Before checking for details of the displayed data, the system checks for the authorizations to the info provider with certain activity. If the access is granted, then more detailed checks follow. Otherwise, the query results in a no authorization to info provided kind of message. Then the list of authorization relevant characteristics of the info provider is determined. As a last step, the access to the selected data in a certain navigational step is checked, always if necessary. If this check fails, there are some combinations for selected data that are not authorized. So in that case, a no sufficient authorization message will be displayed. In planning the info provider, specific checks are repeated for different activities. Now, when the log is generated by RSSM RSecAdmin, the result would contain the following information. It would have a something called as a protocol header, because this result is generated in the database as an XML in an XML based format, but when it gets displayed, it gets displayed as a readable form as a HTML page. It can be saved or printed because of HTML format. You can view it again. If you download it, if you save the output, you can save it as with any HTML viewer. So when the result of the trace will contain contains these pieces of information. And the first top is the protocol header. Now at the beginning of each protocol, there is a header that contains the time and date of the executed authorization check. That is, if the available query name and info provider name and the name of the user who has executed the query, and possibly the name of a restricted user, which may be different if the query was executed by a power user with analysis of authorizations of for another user. Timestamp with the execution time on the local server and the time of the server of execution, and the calling transaction code is also listed. Now each of the blocks are separated by header lines with an underlying color. We'll see when we do the troubleshooting demo. Now the next block that you will have is the info provider check. Now as a first check, the system checks whether any of the authorization that is valid has the required combination of info provider and activity. Now this is nothing else than a check for a sufficient combination on the mandatory info objects. That is the three characteristics which are needed for info provider, activity, and validity. So this would contain checks for those characteristics. The next block we'll have is the attributes. Now, during the execution of a query, there usually is always a check for the attributes which are authorized for an info object. And they are displayed in a table which also contains information on the attributes, whether it is just a display attribute or a navigational attribute. So if it's a display attribute, it will be represented by the letters DIS, and if it's a navigational attribute, it will be represented by the word NAV. The next block we have will be in the log is the value authorizations. Now the next, and here the list of authorized values on a characteristic is represented. Now it is possible to check whether this is the expected result. In some cases, the authorized values are displayed as integer numbers, which are also called the surrogate IDs or the SIDs. SIDs. This may be the case in some cases where also leaves of hierarchy nodes are required. Now, the thing to remember here is that value authorizations are always combined from all valid authorizations for the current info provider. This means that all values from all authorizations for the info providers are put together into the list of authorized values. So the next block in the log, trace log, will be about hierarchy authorizations. Now here, the list of authorized nodes is given together with some more technical information on the authorizations, such as authorization type, level, validity scope, together with information on the selected hierarchy itself. The relevant characteristics block is a section which is quite basic and helpful for analysis authorization issues. This section, the list of characteristics are usual that are actually relevant for the authorization checks is determined. Now, it is also the list of all characteristics that are marked as authorization relevant in the info object maintenance, including the navigational attributes, reduced by those ones for which the user has full authorizations. The next block in the log is the detailed checks, and this is the most detailed one. It contains the information on the detailed combinatorial checks of selections against the authorizations. So this section starts with some preparations as a consistency checks of the nodes and the interval. And this structure will reflect several subsections of checks which may fail individually. The last section that you have is the buffer filling and pre-optimizations. Now all information on authorizations are usually required several times. For example, during navigational steps or even for several value helps on authorization relevant info objects. Since the preparing steps that must or may be done before actual authorization processing take a certain amount of time, all necessary information is buffered at the first call. The most important steps of this buffering are extensions and the merging of authorizations, which means summarizing the authorizations that can enhance each other. So the merging summarizes authorizations that differ in one dimension, that is one characteristics. So the trace results will contain a lot of information about the entire execution that the user performs on a query. So to summarize, the troubleshooting in BI is done using the transaction RSec admin. And this is used for troubleshooting any issues with analysis authorizations. Again, this RSec admin is a replacement for transaction RSSM and RSSM trace that was available to us in BW. So that's another difference between BI and BW.